Welcome, everybody, to a very exciting episode over here. We have the great pleasure of being with Rabbi Rav Pinson, a prolific author and lecturer. And I look forward to a great conversation because Rabbi Pinson always has very, very deep insights on really everything under the sun, particularly with matters relating to the soul. And that's kind of the angle that I'd like to go with you, Rabbi Pinson. First of all, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And look forward to a great conversation. So just to jump right into the
Yeah.
discussion about the soul, um, could you explain to us a little bit more about what the difference is between consciousness and the soul? A lot of times those terms are used in an intertwined sort of way. People misconstrue them. If you could give us maybe a clear picture of what the difference between consciousness and soul would be.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the basic difference when people talk about consciousness, it's like a certain state that you're in, like you're in a consciousness of a particular state. And a person wants to have a broader state of consciousness or a wider or more expansive state of consciousness. So consciousness would be sort of related to the state that you're at. And when we say the word soul, it includes that as well. But the more specifically, and this is why in the Jewish tradition, there are different levels of soul, and they can also be defined as almost like different levels of consciousness. So, for example, a person is, let's say, doing a particular action, and they're very, involved in their action that they're doing. Let's say something, they're building something or creating something with their hands. So there's a functional consciousness that's happening. Your consciousness is in a state of like functionality. And then there'll be like a higher level of consciousness or a deeper level of consciousness, which is not just pedestrian or maybe just doing something. And they're not mutually exclusive. They can actually be included both in the same states. But is also a person's having a certain feeling. So you're feeling a certain thing. And an expansive consciousness of feeling would be you're feeling love and you're feeling inclusion and you're feeling connection versus you're feeling afraid or anger, which would be also a consciousness, which is a restrictive state. So you can be doing something and feeling, or you can just have the feeling in itself. That would be like a more an emotional state of consciousness. Which in Hebrew the word for that would be one is nefesh, which would be like the functional consciousness, and one would be called ruach or spirit, which would be more connected to our emotional consciousness. And then there's a more cerebral, a more mental consciousness, which is that I'm thoughtful and I'm introspective or self-reflective. This is all part of my mindful, my mental state. And my states of consciousness could be also in my mental states of consciousness. Could be again, I can have expansive mind and I could feel an openness of thought and creativity, or I could feel very restrictive and feel very stuck. And then there's like the higher level of consciousness, which is really when we talk about the soul, the way mostly we define soul, which is a spiritual sense of consciousness, which is something that is beyond the immediate empirical physical action, something that's even more and deeper than the emotional state that I'm at and the consciousness that I'm at, something more deeper than my mental state of consciousness. And it's a spiritual sense of consciousness, means I'm sensing some type of interconnectivity with everything with something that is deeper and higher than what I'm observing in the immediate. That's like a higher level of consciousness, which just means that it's a higher level of soul, a much more deeper level of who we are. Those levels of spiritual consciousness, and there's even something that's deeper, the fifth level of soul, which is like transcendent, or to say better, it's like inclusive transcendent consciousness, which is that I am completely something and yet part of everything. And every single thing is a unique thing and yet totally interconnected and part of one organism, which will be the higher level, the highest, deepest level of my soul. So consciousness generally, for most people, in a very colloquial manner, generally refers to like just an expansion of almost of mind or of a state that I am. But in terms of what we talk about, the world of souls, there are many different levels or grades of states of soul that I can be in contact with at all times.
So could you say, would it be accurate to say that so my consciousness, my awareness, we use the example of feeling or thinking. I'm in this feeling state of consciousness. I am experiencing this sort of feeling. Could you say that the one doing the feeling is the consciousness, is like your awareness, your identity, if you will, and the soul is sort of the one that is doing the experience, is the I that is feeling? Would that be like?
So you're touching on a very important distinction here, because there is in life there is the experience and the experiencer. So there's the feeling and the feeler, and there's the thought and there's the thinker. So in to just make it a little more simple if possible, like the three levels that we talked about in states of consciousness, which is my functional consciousness, my mental consciousness, and my emotional consciousness. The my soul is sort of the backdrop that's experiencing these things. It's sort of the experiencer of these experiences. So my particular feeling, or people thought, or people action I'm doing, it's the feeler versus the feeling. In the higher levels of consciousness, which is the levels of the deeper levels of the soul, I'm actually being one with that. I'm
I
becoming
see.
the witness self or the observing self is me and myself. There's no longer a separation between there's me as having these experiences versus me, the experiencer, observing myself having these experiences. I'm actually one and the same. I am that state. And in that state, that's why there's the interconnectivity and the oneness within everything, because ultimately there's only one. There's only one big observer, if you wish. I don't know if it's the right word, but there's God. That's
Right.
the one backdrop through which all of reality is a manifestation of that truth. And when the more I'm connected to that reality within myself, the deeper states that I'm connected to, the more I'm connected to that oneness that is the observing self that observes everything that's occurring.
So would it be I guess correct to say that my consciousness or my so-called self-identity, if you will, is sort of what what sort of gives me the perception of being something separate from God, and the goal is to sort of, in lack of a better term, to sort of lose that as I ascend in consciousness, to sort of uh, become more in touch with my actual identity, which is the oneness of God and all of creation, and lose my sort of independent uh,
But
expression or identity.
yeah, you're touching on a very important question. And I think here's where Judaism and Kabbalah has a very unique understanding of this that is not, for some reason, not popular in the world. Um, the more popular version of that would be there is, let's say, the experiences of my life, which is my finite self. I'm feeling this particular emotion, whether it's anger or love, but it's a particular emotion. And when I'm feeling one thing, I'm not feeling the other thing, or I'm thinking one particular thought, which is a finite expression of my thought process, or I'm actually doing something. So that's all my finite self. And then there's something that's beyond that. In Hebrew, it's called Achaya, which is the life force, which will be like my infinity or my observing self, which is the witness self, that's the experiencer, the feeler, the doer that's doing all these things, that's feeling all those things. And that is the infinite part of self. So when I enter into that higher level of consciousness, the sense of self of my finite self collapses within the infinity of who we are, all collectively part of this one grand observer, which, for lack of better words, we call Hashem or God, whatever the description you're saying, but that's the part of one of his God. And that's almost where most understandings of spirituality ends at there. So it's almost like either you're in your finite self and you're very individual and you have distinct desires and wills and life and your journey through life, your incarnation is very particular to that thing, or you recognize that you're just part of this one seamless whole and you collapse into infinity.
Uh-huh.
So the metaphor would be, let's say, life is sort of this wave that rises up from the ocean. And then ultimately, the idea would be to collapse back into the ocean, become part of the everything. And that's like the fourth level of soul. But there's actually something that's deeper. And in the there's a sort of a metaphor. This is a very classic metaphor of a wave in the ocean. And there's a metaphor similar by the great tzaddik and the great sage, the Maggid of Mesr, who's a primary student of the Baal Shem Tov, this great mystic that lived in the 1700s, and he writes, this great Kabbalist, and he writes that in the metaphor that he uses, it's almost like a wave that becomes individualized, that rises up from the ocean, and then returns back into the ocean, but retains its waveness, meaning it retains its actually distinction and individuality. And that's why I said
I see.
and that's why I said that the word for the highest level of the soul to translate it would be inclusive transcendence, which is almost paradoxical because transcendence means the exclusion of individuality, right? It's just about the collapse of self, the finite self of infinity. Inclusive transcendence is that the ultimate non-duality includes duality as well. That's the ultimate peak of non-duality because when something is so you have this like a binary system. Either it's dual and it's separation and
Right.
individual, or it's non-dual and it's a singularity. And Kabbalah and Judaism reveals that there's something that actually there's a context that holds the non-duality and the duality together, and they're both simultaneously true. Infinity and finitude are both the expressions of ultimately of the ultimate of the creator of Hashem, and they're both just expressions. In our soul, it's the same way, which means the purpose of life is not to disappear. The purpose of life is not to collapse for finite dreams and ambitions and desires and just become part of the ultimate observer of life and just, just move with and just, stop being an individual self. The purpose of life is to be the individual self fully. The goal is not disappearance, it's eternity. Eternity means I completely survive as a particular expression of the divine in my own ways of thinking, my own ways of doing, my own ways of being. And simultaneously, I'm actually collapsed within the ultimate transcendence that includes both the non-dual and the dual. So I don't lose my duality, but I include my duality within the non-dual, which would be the fifth level of soul, and that's why it's the ultimate way of living.
So that's really fascinating, and I think it actually kind of is a good lead into the next question. I sent out to a few people some questions that they would like to know, and I personally would like to know as well. So one question that comes up commonly about the afterlife, because that's when the soul finally reaps its reward and experiences all of the either the pleasure of the good that it did or the purifying of what it maybe needs purifying from. But the question that's often asked is in the afterlife experience, when the soul is detached now from its bodily existence, does the consciousness that was accompanying it during its lifetime, is that maintained? In other words, when my time comes, will I be Pinchas Taylor subsumed in the oneness of God, but still sort of retain the memories and experiences that I had while in a body?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly this paradigm answers this particular question
Yeah,
because in the way the Torah reveals the past life experiences that there is, like you said, there's a process, which means either I'm reaping the rewards, whatever. This is like kind of a language that we're using, but it doesn't mean that in such a trivial way. But a person's
sure.
reaping the rewards or experiencing some type of refinement, which means that I'm retaining my individuality, right? Because otherwise, what rewards am I receiving, or what kind of experiences am I going through? There must be a me that's experiencing these things, and yet we say that you become part of the oneness of Hashem, the oneness of God, part of the whole. And that's really where it becomes almost like paradoxical, where you are and you will always retain your individuality, who you are, your memories. And that really depends how much of you is retained, is really a matter of how much goodness you did in this world. If a person does 100% goodness, then their full memory is retained and the fullness of their self will retain for all eternity. And in that process, of becoming unified with the collective, becoming one with the memory of God, which is another Kabbalistic way. In Kabbalistic language, is called Bina, or some type of sphere idea of like the intelligence, is that I still retain my particularity in the unity of within everything. And I think it's not the question is not only just in terms of an afterlife journey, but really the question is how we live our life today. Like if the more I live my life today in this paradox, which is I am fully embodying who I am as a person and living my talents and living my genius, living my potentials fully, whatever Hashem gave me, whatever the creator gave me, and living that life, and simultaneously recognizing that we're all also part of one. And to able to retain the particularity and the universality of things, to able to say the finitude and the infinity simultaneously. I think that's where the trick of life really comes. And that's so much of Jewish practice of doing mitzvahs is actually is that exactly to try to maintain this paradoxical, at least to the mind, paradoxical way of living where I'm fully myself and yet I'm fully part of everything else as well simultaneously.
So this is great, and I think so. This kind of also leads into, because a lot of times people think about, when they think about the soul, they think about more of the afterlife when it's detached from the body and sort of experiencing the ultimate truth.
Yeah.
So people will often also talk about that uh, there is language in Jewish literature about even confronting loved ones in past generations and people who have other souls that have been here before in the heavenly realms. What does that actually, for lack of a better term, look like with other loved ones, deceased friends and family members and whatnot? How does that play in the afterlife experience? So I have my identity, and there's other people in my circle that share in my identity, if you will, that helped shape me as a person, that people that I lived my life with and were part of my refining process. Where does that leave us in the afterlife? We retain that connection? What might that connection look like in a non-bodily form and in an afterlife existence?
Right. So I think the one way to think about this is that everyone that we experience in this world, every person that we're experiencing in this world, and certainly the people like our loved ones that we experience at a much more intimate level, a much more frequent level, is really part of our soul purpose, our soul journey. And these are souls that are connected to us. And the reason why, you're married to this person and these are your children, these are your parents, these are your siblings, is not just some random act or even some just biological act of genetic patterns, but there's a spiritual connection that means that if I am the child of so and so, and these are my siblings and these are my children, these are the people that I'm attracted to in this lifetime, these are even my community people. This means that we share a common root soul and we have a certain commonality in terms of what we have to affect in this world. And sometimes it's almost like the inverse. We both have to do something, but you have to do it from maybe a more compassionate side. And the other one has to come from a more strength and discipline side. But we're all working on the same things, working the same for the purpose of our particular tikkun, but collectively we're working part of the same. So and just like in life, the real relationships that we have with people, of course, is intimate and physical and tangible. But if you're just sitting here and you're thinking about your wife or your spouse or your husband or your child, even though you're physically not with them, you're completely with them. Because when
Right.
we're encountering people, there is the physical dimension. Of course, you can see and touch them. But when you say I'm connected to these people, 80% of the day you don't actually see them, or maybe 90%, maybe sometimes 100%
Right.
of the day you haven't seen these people,
Right.
but you're still connected to them. So we're not talking about a very physical sensation anyways. We're talking about something that lives in your memory, in your experiencing of them, in your recalling of these experiences that you had with them, and that's where you're living. So essentially you're living in a cerebral space of of connectivity. And because all the essential difference between living in this planet or this world and living in an afterlife process is that we just drop the body, which means and we drop the ability to create new memory, if you will, because we
Yeah.
don't have the sensations, that we don't have the intake to create new memory. But the entirety of who we are, which is our memory essentially, is in store, is full. So that has and that gravitates, that memory house, so to speak, of that individual person will gravitate towards the loved ones that they experience in this life as well, because that's their source of their soul will be rooted back into that place, which is another Kabbalistic idea, but is a little more complicated, which is like the different parts of the body of Adam, and they represent different body parts, which represent different types of souls. So let's just give like a very general idea. So like hand souls connected to the hand of the body of Adam, of this primordial being, will go back to the place of the hand. And incidentally, the Zohar, which is the primary text of Kabbalistic wisdom, speaks about the person meeting up with their loved ones, obviously not physically, but the memory meeting up with the other person's memory and having some type of interconnection. We have to stop thinking spatial, because That's where we get tangled because it's not space. It's right here. There's no other space. So is the greatest pleasure for the soul. And one of the greatest pleasures of the afterlife is actually meeting up with the people that you love and were connected with throughout this life, and then meeting up with those people. So there's definitely that dimension, and it's just without the body. And I think most of our experiences
Right.
that we have with loved ones are without the body, anyways. So it's the same thing.
Okay, so that may also be a nice segue into one of the next questions that was asked, and this question comes up in different contexts, whether we're talking about the afterlife, where people are talking about when Mashiach comes, when the
Yeah.
glory of God and all spirituality is revealed in the physical world with the resurrection of the dead and so forth. The question is presented mostly in the same way, and it's based on the fact that we are primarily physical creatures now, and our primary desires, our innate drives, are towards the physical. People ask the question, sort of, what do we do in the afterlife? What is that experience like? And when Mashiach comes and Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, takes place, what does that actually look like? And a lot of people, when it comes to resurrection of the dead, have a difficulty with it, because if it's all about studying Torah all day and that's not their primary focus in life right now, it seems like, well, what are we hoping for this day for? Like, why am I so interested and excited about Mashiach coming if that's not really something that I want to be occupying the entirety of my life and day and whatnot with? So what would you say uh, to somebody asking this question, whether we're talking about I think it's essentially the same question, whether we're talking about the afterlife or when Mashiach comes, a physical manifestation, let's say, of the afterlife where the oneness of God is fully revealed, is that experience, that existence, that state of being, what does that experience, what does it feel like? What is it like?
I mean, yeah, it seems like the same question. You can actually divide the question in two because um, there's an afterlife experience, which is one conversation, which is what is the afterlife experience? And the what you do. I mean, when the sages reveal and say that you sit and study Torah the whole day, what does that mean? You're opening up a Gemara and reading from book. Obviously, it
Right.
actually doesn't mean that. It means that you are completely submerged simultaneously, again, submerged in the oneness of Hashem. It's in translated into a very simple level would be the peak experiences of pleasure is when the self collapses in something else, whether it's a music or art or food or another person. It's always the absence of self into something larger, something different, something more. That's what pleasure is. So it's paradoxical, seemingly paradoxical, because people think that pleasurable things is when the I is experiencing it, when I'm experiencing things. But ultimate pleasure is the absence of self. Let's say a person is enjoying music and they're listening to themselves enjoying the music and analyzing the music while they're listening to the music. They're not enjoying the music. The way you really know if you enjoy music is if music has been played for, let's say, 5 minutes, and then you're like, and then after it stops, like, where was I? Like, what just happened?
Right.
That's
Uh-huh,
because there's
uh-huh.
the loss of self into something else. It could be music, it could be art, it could be with another person, it could be anything that a person loses himself. That's the peak of oining, the peak of pleasure is the absence of self. Gan Eden is that experience. Gan Eden is the peak of divine pleasure, pleasure of self completely submerged in something that's greater. Most people say, but I don't enjoy that. Like because if I study Torah, I don't enjoy that. Yeah, but you enjoy pleasure. Everyone loves pleasure. Pleasure is the highest dimension that we have. So translate that, what that would look like in your own life. What are the most pleasurable things? And then think like this. When I'm experiencing pleasure, usually it's one sense. One of my senses are being pleasured, and I'm
Yeah.
experiencing it in one location in the body. And the ultimate pleasure would be all the senses, well, there's no sense technically, but all the entire self experiencing the fullness of pleasure in the entire sense. And that would be so in a very translated way. Once the Baal Shem Tov when the great Tzaddik master we mentioned before, he said that almost like a light way of saying it, but it was just a way to understand it. He said that he had his horse driver, I guess his not a chauffeur. I mean, the guy that rides the horse, his wagon driver,
Pleasure.
was
Yeah.
passed away, and he's told the students that he has a beautiful Gan Eden. He has a beautiful paradise, and said, what would that mean for him? Like he's a simple person. What does it mean? He's not studying. He said, no, in his paradise, he has the best horse possible, and he has an straight open road that's like millions of miles long, and he's flying on that horse. And for him, that's Gan Eden, that's paradise. Of course, it's not literal, but that's the experience, the way he's translating the experience, what it would look like for that type of person, for a person that enjoys riding a horse on an open meadow. That's the experience of that type of pleasure. That's what he's doing now in Gan Eden.
So it is the ultimate expression, like the pinnacle of your own self-expression, of like what you
Correct.
gave to the
What
world. It sounds almost like, and I know there's a famous analogy from the Baal Shem Tov about the forks, about the one in
Yeah,
heaven is
yeah,
giving and the one in hell
right.
is
He's
is
giving,
taking. So
right.
it sounds like the afterlife experience is very much personalized. It's very much, it's not like
Correct.
people tend to think of it as a place that you go. It's more experience that you have that's personalized to you.
Right. It's not. There's no place to go. Right. Obviously, there's no space. It's the experience. It's the experience of being in the oneness of the Creator, but translated through the filter of your own experiences. So if you're a scholar, that's what it looks like studying. If you're someone else, it looks a little different. At least it's interpreted a little different. But ultimately, it's about becoming one with Hashem. Now, the question of the question of the resurrection and what we'll be doing, I think a lot of the conversation and the reason why it's so hard to wrap our mind around this is because we experience life through or aliveness through friction. We experience creativity through opposites. This is the way we move. There's a dialectic. There's always something that's pushing us one way. We experience sadness, and then when we experience joy, it's the joy of overcoming the sadness. We think things in a very dualistic way, and one against the other. Um, that's because the world that we're created in and the world that we function in, the three-dimensional universe that we have, is a very dualistic paradigm. The Tchias HaMesim and the resurrection, the time of Mashiach, the ultimate time, is when that collapses, so to speak. When that whole sense of the duality of things, where it's friction, creativity, opposites, and that whole world of opposites stops. And we don't know what that means. We don't have those types of experiences normally. And to us, the way it would be translated to us, to the modern person living in the present world, it would seem very boring. It would be no desire, because desire also comes from lack. I'm missing something, I desire and I receive it. But if I don't lack anything, so why would I desire anything? And if I'm not missing anything, I
Mm.
have no question, why would I need an answer? So actually, the rabbis in the Talmud say use this language that the future is Yom Hashem L'Chayfetz, it's days without desire, to our mind, because in our mind, desire only exists within the world of
I
opposites
see.
and the world dialectic. But ultimately, there's another way of being, which we don't know what that means. There's another way of being, which will be revealed, and it'll be the ultimate, pleasure, the ultimate way of living life.
Okay. So along these same lines of both the afterlife and the future world of resurrection, so there's a question that comes up quite a bit when it comes to reincarnation, to Gilgulin. And this is regarding, so a lot of people tend to think of reincarnation the way that it's maybe in the books or the movies, or in Brian Weiss, and these sorts of, that it's basically your entire soul, and it may need some sort of correction, and your entire soul is then becomes enclosed in another body, another existence, another identity. And what from what I've read is that it seems to be not that the entirety of your identity, because that your identity, like me as me, is going to be rewarded upon, like rewarded or refined, and there may be some aspect of me that needs some correction, and the only way to do that is through basically that aspect of soul. I tend to think of like an example of, you have like a bonfire, and then there's like you light a candle or 10 candles from that bonfire, that these can all be separate identities or separate existences that come from the same bonfire. So the bonfire is warming people over here, but I can take a candle from it or a torch and light over there. And so yes, it all comes from the same essence, but it can have its own separate identity. Would you say that reincarnation kind of functions in that way, that me as Pinchas, when my time comes, will either be rewarded or refined based on the life that I lived, and I'll have my own identity connecting with Hashem in that way. But if there's an aspect of soul that does need correction in the way of reincarnation, that it's not my entire identity and self that is then put into a different human, it's some aspect of soul that gets its own identity, sort of like a torch being taken from a bonfire. Would that be an appropriate analogy? Is there a different
Okay,
way that
so
we could look at it?
so it's a complicated topic, and I think you raised a lot of interesting ways of thinking about this. Um, the One of the famous questions that were asked to the Kabbalists, was asked to the Rajba, to others, of what was the question of, if we believe in an afterlife process, like Gan Eden, paradise, or the opposite, hell, we believe there's some type of process that an individual has to go through. How does that jive with the idea of a reincarnation, which means that the soul after 120 will go down into the next body? Other traditions, Lavdil, that speak about this idea of reincarnations will say there is no afterlife, there is no Gan Eden or Gehenna, there is no process. It's only this life, and you're just constantly wheel, moving from one life into the next. So here's where it gets a little subtle and a little different, according to the writings of the Arizal, the great mystic of the 1500s, Isaac Luria. So he writes like this, that every person has to come down to the world to manifest, in his language, is 613 parts. And that's like the collective idea of the mitzvot. So that 613 parts, and it's not literal 613, but let's just use that number. Let's say multiple times. Every soul has to come out to reveal itself multiple times, which means that every soul has to live different types of lives. So one life, to make it very simple, like one life, you have to be a rich person, you have to be more wealthy, and you have to learn the art of giving. The next life, maybe you have to be poor and learn the art of receiving. So if you lived a very exemplary life and you're a rich man and you gave a lot of charity, that's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. But there are parts of your soul that were not activated, not revealed. That's the parts of your consciousness, of your soul, that were not manifest in this world, which is learning the art of receiving. So let's say you, Pinchas, is a very wealthy man, and this is what you lived your life, okay? And let's say you're a rabbi, and this you live your life. You're a teacher, and you receive, let's say, your perfect life, and you lived a beautiful life. After 120, your soul will go into its own journey and not return back into this world. It will go into its own journey in the afterlife process. And the parts of your soul that were not activated, not because you did anything negative, it's nothing to do with negative. It's just you never activate those parts of the soul
The
because that's not the
context
life
of
you
my
live.
life at that point was not,
Exactly.
yeah.
The context of your
Okay.
life at that point did not, allow for that type of revelation. So your soul will now come back into another form of life and achieve a different type of life, a different life, in order to achieve its purpose. So your soul almost divides itself. And the relationship between your soul, the wealthy person or the rabbi, versus the soul of a student or the poor person, let's say that analogy, would be very tenuous, because yes, there were parts of that soul that existed within you. They're like latent parts of the soul, but they were not part of your conscious soul. They're not part of your conscious self. You have no memory. And that memory, which is part of your soul now today, becomes like, your memory is written on the backdrop of your soul. That becomes your story and remains your story. The parts of the soul that were never activated, not because of any tickle, nothing you did wrong, that's in the context, that's the soul that would reincarnate. There's another form of reincarnation, which is unusual, but is possible, where the entirety of who you are, which means with your memory, will be incarnated. That is precisely to undo something that was done in the past life. If you did certain things in your past life that needs correction, and these are things that cannot be worked out in a spiritual realm. Let's say, for example, not you, but if a person, let's say, steals money for someone, who was dishonest financially with another individual, and never reprimanded it, never repaired it, never, did tshuva, did transform themselves, asked forgiveness, gave back the money, etc. This person will have to come back into another form, another life, which means we'll be born again, the fullness of that soul, without the memory, the fullness of that soul, will be born into another individual and go through the same life patterns in order to fix the things that were done in the past life. It's also possible, which is transmigration, with that level of your consciousness, with your memory, will transmigrate into other forms of life to learn a particular tikkun, a particular lesson that has to be learned, and then will leave that particular form of life. So it's generally, it's not to rectify our past life reincarnation. It's to live different contexts of our lives, to reveal all different aspects of our soul. But yes, unusual but possible things that we do in this life messed up so badly that maybe we have to come back again and do trial two. Or in the words of the Zohar, it's like three strikes and you're out. You get three times to repair this mistake, and God willing, you don't do this. The only thing that I would say, and this is very important, you don't have to wait for your next life to do that. The main thing is like be conscious about what you've done in this world and constantly do self reflection and think about your life and make sure that you haven't hurt people and you haven't stolen or taken money from anyone or done things that are wrong and try to repair them so you won't have to worry about this whole thing.
So the question is, with regarding like extreme examples, let's say you have
Yeah.
like a Hitler character who, so this afterlife experience, I've gotten different viewpoints that there's an eternal punishment, or it's a non-existence, or an awareness of your own non-existence. What happens to someone of that sort of extreme nature, evil that's completely devoid of any good?
Okay, so I would say first of all, we don't believe in eternal punishment. There's nothing is eternal. Definitely negative. Negativity doesn't exist eternally. Only positivity exists eternally. So internal condemnation is not. We don't believe in that idea.
Yeah.
And the mission already mentioned idiots. It could be 12 months, a certain months, but it's a process, as everyone gets out of that. There is something that the Torah describes, which is called karas, and which means the erasing. This is why when people say, let's say Hitler, they'll say Yamach Shemayim, may his name be erased. What that means, what symbolically what that means is that there are certain really terrible people that did terrible things in this world, and their life was this one big, X in this world. This person, remember, the what survives of a person, like we explained before, is a person's memory, right? That's the fullness of yourself, which is essentially your memory. That's what's, when I'm experiencing you right now, we're having this conversation. It's really my past memory having a conversation in the present, with your past memory having a conversation in the present. That's the fullness of yourself. It lives in that memory. But not conscious memory, not conscious memory, but that's where the storage house of all those experiences is in your memory in your brain. So what happens after 120 for a person that's completely evil, it's deleted, meaning the hard drive is deleted. The actual hard drive, which is the soul, is part of God. I don't know, particularly in the case of Hitler, but the idea is that the soul is an Epsilon kiss for his Chelik Kalbimal, is a part of Hashem, is part of the Creator. That never disappears. That's just the hard drive. What we imprint on the hard drive and the story that we tell, because life is a story and we're its author. So the story that we're writing on this hard drive or this floppy disk, to use an older analogy, the story that we're writing on this, it becomes completely erased if it's a negative story. So Hitler is Yamach Shemoy. Hitler doesn't exist. His memory is destroyed. His entire hard drive. The backdrop of a soul that does something very negative still will incarnate again to reach some tikkun and go through other processes. But the neshama itself is eternal.
So to bring it full circle, it sounds like the spark continues, but the consciousness is erased.
Correct. That's correct. That's correct.
That's to bring it full circle. So
I
want to be respectful of your time, and I so appreciate you being with us today. Rabbi Pinson has a lot of books available. I think the best place to get them is directly on your website on iyun.com.
No, you just you can go on Amazon, just press
Amazon.
and do Dov Bar Pinson, and all the books should show up.
And if you're looking for something for upcoming holiday of Pesach, so Rabbi Pinson has a monthly assessment of each of the Jewish months of the year, where he goes through very spiritual ideas regarding each month and the themes and holidays and whatnot that are relevant to that particular time. There's one on the Haggadah also that Rabbi Pinson has. So that would be good for upcoming holidays, but there's a wide variety out there that I'm sure will tickle the fancy of many of
Just
our
if
viewers.
we're talking about this in this conversation, a lot of the things that we talk about in souls and the afterlife and reincarnation is a book. I forgot how it's called. It's called Life, Jewish Life, Life After Life, something like that. I think it's Life After Life, Jewish something. But you put my name, Life After Life, it would show up. It's an older book, but a lot of the conversation that we had is on that idea.
Right. So Rabbi Pinson has a variety of books in the regard to reincarnation and the afterlife. And I highly recommend you go check them out. You will not be disappointed. And thank you so much, Rabbi Pinson, for being with us.